Here we are at another episode of ShiftED podcasts. I'm super fortunate to have connected with Susan Linn, who's a world-renowned expert actually in creative play and also the impacts of media on our youngest learners. So Susan, thanks so much for hopping on here today and sharing some of your ideas behind our youngest learners and how the world affects these little guys.
I'm so happy to be talking to you, Chris.
Thanks so much. So I always kind of like to rewind a little bit in time and kind of like when did your interest in play, particularly for students, start to percolate?
I've always been interested in play. I earned my living for a lot of years as a ventriloquist.
Right.
Performed for children. I worked with Fred Rogers on his program, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. I also did play therapy with puppets
Right.
for a long time, with kids coping with all sorts of really difficult life challenges. So it's always been an interest of mine. It was certainly incredibly important to me as a child, and many of my best memories of childhood have to do with these kinds of plays and all sorts of things that I, my sister, my friends did, that we all did together.
Right.
And then as I began, to get increasingly interested in children and child development as I became an adult, I encountered D.W. Winnicott, who was this incredible pediatrician in the 1950s who really found a psychological place for play and it's important. And basically, what he said is that play, creativity, and health are all connected, and that play and creativity are essential to a healthy life.
Interesting. And what it is, I kind of want to dive a little deeper on puppets as therapy. Like, where does that philosophy or that idea of having a character almost that allows you to gain access into perhaps some of the psyche of a child, how does that play out?
Well, first of all, it's important to remember that play, creative play, is the foundation of learning, creativity, constructive problem solving, and the capacity to wrestle with life to make it meaningful. That's how kids strive to understand the world about them, is through creative play. And really, it's a window into children's hearts and minds. And so that's a gift to them, and it's also a gift to us. When we play out of our experience because it's all that we have, really. And so when children are engaged in creative play, they reveal parts of their lives or aspects of their lives or things that they're working on. Right. And when you're doing play therapy with puppets, or any kind of play therapy, of course, you're often dealing with really, really difficult issues for kids. And puppets are particularly useful for that because, first of all, they're safe. And when even with adults, if an adult puts a puppet on their hand, then they often say and do things that they wouldn't say and do otherwise. Right. I mean, it works with adults, but it also works with kids. The puppet's kind of like a screen. And I call it's the not me, it's him syndrome, because I was once making puppets with a bunch of kids, and one child put a puppet on his hand and went racing around the room saying terrible things to all the other kids. And this teacher said, Charlie, stop. And he said, it's not me. I didn't say it. It's him. He said it. So, obviously that wasn't a terrific thing for him to be doing, and he needed to stop doing it. But that's kind of really the essence of why puppets are so effective. And that's if a child has a puppet. If an adult has a puppet, then that puppet can serve as a model for expressing feelings, or ask questions that it might be too hard for the child to ask. And also, my puppets are always younger than the kids that I was working with. Right. And so the kids get to be more in control. They get to make decisions. They get to have power. Children don't have very much power.
Right.
So this provides an opportunity for them to gain some kind of sense of competency over what's happening in their lives.
Right. That's really interesting. And play, I mean, talking with educators, preschool educators up here in Quebec, Canada, they always have a bit of a tricky idea of what is creative play, what is play, sometimes it's misconceived as like recess, right? But like in our program up here in Canada, we have free play that is in classroom time for our youngest learners. How would you describe play to educators? Like what it is at its essence of, because you ask kids, I mean, they'll tell you 100 different words at what play is. I ask the same question to educators, and there's less. It kind of like we forget what play is as the older we get. Mm-hmm. What is play to you?
Well, what play is to me is the intersection of what's inside of us and what's outside of us. And again, that also comes from Winnicott. When you play, what's happening is real and not real at the same time. Play is a paradox because of that. And so, if you're manipulating figures or something like that, you're really manipulating the fingers and the figures, and you're making them talk. That's really happening. But at the same time, the figures are pretend.
Right.
So creative play has to be safe. It has to be psychologically safe for kids. They have to be physically safe, and you can't force something to play. For neurotypical kids, and certainly some children who are not neurotypical, play comes naturally to them. I mean, they're born with the capacity for that. And if you watch babies as they develop, they play. I mean, they as they're exploring the world, they play with their fingers, for instance, just seeing how they work, and just get enormous pleasure from that. So, but play is hard to define. It is, but I think it's also when the experience is more important than the outcome.
Right.
Once the outcome becomes the most important thing, that becomes work. Right.
There you go. Very wise words, Susan. Yes, absolutely. It's similar. Like I visited MIT's lifelong kindergarten, and that mindset that play should be in our lives always. But it seems as soon as we hit grade 1, play is kind of like, okay, that's over with now. And now we're going to, like you just mentioned, focus on outcomes rather than process or fun play. Why do you think that mindset is in education still, after all these years of, the industrial kind of model of education? why is that so hard for us to shake?
Yeah, and it's a huge problem, isn't it? That we're
Yeah.
not shaking that.
And
I
it's
think,
not here or there. I think it's a global, like we have
right.
this archaic way of how we believe we should teach children. And I mean, there's so much research out there that says it might not be as effective as we think. It might work for 50%, 40% of the population, but it's not touching every learner.
Right. I mean, I think one thing is that as a society we are results oriented, and it's easier to measure the results of standardized tests.
Mm.
So I think that our focus as a society on results, and not so much on process, that I think that really does certainly trickle down to entertainment, and there's also this sense that kids don't want to learn,
Hmm.
and that they have to be forced to learn, and it has to be rigid, and that there's one way to teach everybody. And I think that also affects how play is increasingly, unfortunately, being like ejected from early childhood education even.
Right. Yeah, I agree with you. What do you think the consequences are? And I know that you touch on this a little bit in your latest book too. Who's raising these kids, right? Who's raising our kids? How, how is that? How is things shifting towards more and more of this kind of this removal of um, play, togetherness, and more of this kind of individualistic removal almost? Like, what's the psyche or the psychological stuff going on around these kids that are making us ask questions like this? Who is raising our kids?
Well, for one thing, I won't speak for Canada. I'm in the United States. I'll speak about the United States. We are enthralled to the tech industries and also enthralled to corporate America.
Hmm.
And so there is very little regulation in the United States about how companies can target kids, how they can target them with advertising, how the tech industry can target
Hmm.
children. And so, what corporate values or the values of tech companies aren't the same values as child development. I mean, once profit becomes more important than the well-being of children, then the people in power start making decisions that actually undermine healthy child development.
Hmm.
So the whole push, for instance, to get even babies in front of screens, that's coming from the tech industry, and also, unfortunately, sometimes hand in hand with early childhood educators as well, which is terribly problematic. But there's no evidence, for instance, that babies can learn anything meaningful from a screen,
Hmm.
really.
Hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
yet, if you go to YouTube and you search videos for babies, what comes up are just tons of
Right.
videos aimed at babies, using the buzzword now, sensory. They're sensory videos. Now,
Yeah.
how a video can be sensory when all you do is watch it or maybe listen to it, I don't understand. But,
Hmm.
that's a way of selling them, and including selling marketing videos as teaching babies to speak, when in fact, what the research tells us is that babies can't learn from a machine. They don't
Right.
learn language from a machine. It has to be in conversation, in dialogue with a human being.
Hmm.
So, because of our our love of the market and market solutions, to all kinds of problems, a lot of the information that parents are getting about what children need is in fact false.
Hmm.
I mean, apps are marketed as educational when there's, really they have no evidence that they actually are
Right.
Educational. And we not just it's not just that we allow it, we support it and celebrate it.
Similar to what you're expressing, there's no value to it, right? And it takes them away from developing themselves, their their cognitive abilities, their language abilities, that it kind of is it interferes with their developmental growth. But they're saying before 4, like, they don't need it, right? I would push that even further. But is there a similar belief down in the States where parents are made aware of the negative effects and kind of putting to rest those misconceptions that they might have? Like, how do those words, how does that information get out to parents?
That's actually a question that I've really been grappling with and talking to people about recently. The American Pediatric Association now says no screen time for children under 18 months. Except recently, there's been research showing that excessive screen time for kids under the age of 2 actually affects their brain development, including or particularly where the parts of the brain where executive function and self-regulation are housed, where those abilities develop.
Right.
And that's, given that executive function and self-regulation are 2 of the most important attributes, aside from the capacity to love and
Right.
and empathy and all of that.
Right.
But for being able to thrive in the world, I really think that the AAP here needs to change their recommendations. And what we really need is a massive public health campaign around issues relating to young children and technology.
Right.
There is a growing movement here to take on social media for teenagers. And there's actually a bill in Congress, in our Senate, that 48 senators, it's got bipartisan support. That's pretty good so far. We'll see what happens. But people are focused right now on teenagers. But what I think people forget is that it begins in infancy.
Yes.
And the push to get kids into a pattern of all screens all the time starts, just even before babies are born.
Right. And do you think that the pandemic, that COVID had an accelerated effect on that screens started to become more and more available for the youngest, our youngest learners? Like I see, like when I go out to restaurants, for example, like parents will give the phones, the iPads, whatever to the kids to keep them calm so that they sit at the table. And it seems like there's this, like, since the pandemic happened, where we were forced to be on screens, like it was our only way to actually stay social. Has that accelerated, do you think, in a way, how our youngest learners are starting to become almost dependent on these screens?
Yeah, I would say I would take out the almost and say dependent on. And COVID, 2 things happened during the lockdown. One is that there was a big jump in the number of hours that kids, including young children, were spending with screens, including because school was now online. And so kids who were not given iPads, for instance, all of a sudden had them. But what also happened, I think, during COVID is that people began to see the detrimental effects. And so what I think that's led to is a huge jump in grassroots organizations all around the country taking on the issues of excessive screen time for children. So I think in a way it did both. And the rise, the part of the focus of teenagers and social media, that also really escalated after the lockdowns.
What tips and tricks do you recommend for parents? Like, if they're noticing this and they're wanting to try to do something and they just don't know where to start, how do I start to make that separation? Because right now it's really hard. I take the thing away and they lose their stuff and it's just not pleasant. What's some advice or tips that you might have for parents that are kind of grappling with this idea right now?
Okay, first of all, I think it's important for all of us to remember that this is not a family problem, it's a societal problem. And if it's ever going to be fixed, society needs to do it. That said, social change takes time, especially when it's coming from the bottom up. So there are things that parents can do. And one thing is to first of all, avoid screen time for babies and toddlers, with the possible exception of video chatting with adults who love them. So I think postpone that really as long as you can. So that's one thing. But for parents who are already have older kids who are immersed in screens, so what families are doing is carving out times that are screen-free, both for adults and for kids. Meals, family meals. I mean, family meals are important because it is a time where kids learn to socialize. It's a time they learn more about the family. I mean, that conversation around meals is really important. Make sure that there are no screens around. Families are having places for phones to come when both adults and the kids enter the house. That's a possibility. Carve out, one evening a week, at least, where you do something that is offline, whatever it is that you may enjoy. Board games, hiking, singing, whatever your family likes to do together. Make sure, that you do that. And kids need time outside.
Yes.
And they'll get the most benefit from being outside if they're not tied to their phones. I mean, companies push using phones outside because you can identify birds or you can identify plants with your phone. But A, you can look them up afterwards. And B, that's not what is necessarily so meaningful to kids. What's important is that they develop a connection to and a sense of awe about nature and the natural world. So basically, what parents and what parents need to do, which is, I understand that if you've got a kid who is completely immersed in screens all the time, I know that's not going to be easy. But it's really important to help kids find satisfaction in what techies call in real life, IRL. That's what they call it. And it's important for kids to have positive experiences with the rest of the world. And that's going to be increasingly important as the technologies develop. I mean, the metaverse, which is going to be even more addictive, or is more addictive already, than just regular screen time, which is already addictive. It's just going to get more and more compelling, and we are going to increasingly have to make decisions about what's human and what's a machine.
It's fascinating. And I understand. Yes, I mean, it will not get easier, but for the sake of our kids and their futures, I think it's an investment that's well worth it.
Another thing is it's hard to do this alone. See if you can find other families who share your values and see if you can do it together so that your child can't come home and say, I'm the only one, a 10-year-old coming home. I'm the only one who doesn't have a smartphone. There's an organization called Wait Until 8th that helps parents band together to make a decision not to give kids smartphones until 8th grade.
Interesting. Well, I'll put that link in the descriptor as well so people can check that out. That's really cool. Well, Susan, I want to thank you so much. Please go and read Susan's latest book, Who's Raising the Kids? Big Tech, Big Business, and the Lives of Children. It's a fascinating read, and we've touched on a few of the topics that you explore more fully in the book, which I just loved it. It's such a great read and very helpful as well. I find it helpful and hopeful. I'll put those two together. So thank you for joining me today.
Oh, Chris, it's my pleasure.
A lot of fun. Thank you.